Hello, my name is Radvile Kudarauskaite. I am going to present my research for my dissertation, which is called Constructing Masculinity. How did historical and cultural contexts influence the Lithuanian fashionable male ideal in the 1990s? To begin with, Lithuanian men in the 1990s had very little choice to express themselves through fashion, which resulted in all of them looking so similar daily. Alternatively, I decided to review the image of menswear and what reasons made it so stagnant and one-dimensional. My research is an exploration of why male fashion in Lithuania in the 1990s was so homogenous, why men failed to stand out, and what reasons made them think this way through series of in-depth case studies and conducted interviews from the residents of the former LTSR. Reasons for the Lithuanian male oppression could be named as Soviet occupation, Soviet censorship, and shortages of goods, in particular foods and apparel. Secondly, cultural reasons can be identified as the very uniform Soviet fashion, black market of fashionable goods, and popular influence of mafia ideals. Thirdly, psychological reasons are abusive childrearing practices, violence in the Red Army, and toxic masculine traits popularized by influential figures. Today, I would like to focus on the last part of my dissertation, which explores the root issues of masculine repression in Lithuanian men, through studies of childrearing practices, lasting effects of censorship even after the re-establishment of independence, and the popular male image of the 1990s. All of these damaging elements create horrifying effects for Lithuanian males' mental health. There is very little research done on the popular Lithuanian male image. Therefore, this collection of research and in-depth case studies are collected from various fields. Complex historical and cultural contexts, alongside deeply rooted psychological reasons, created this one and only fashionable image of a Lithuanian man in the 1990s. Strikingly masculine, brutal-mannered, and homogeneous to the other men of the time, yet awfully repressed mentally. Let's talk a little bit about toxic hegemonic masculinity tropes in Lithuania from 1980 to 2000s. Kudarauskaite explains the gender roles in Lithuania perfectly. Quote, masculinity marked by physical power, rationality, and control is modeled as an opposition to the passively submissive, emotional voluptas and objectified femininity, the main function of which is to enhance the impression of masculine power. Unquote. Back to the men don't cry stereotype. A photographer, Neringa Rakashute, challenges perceptions of masculinity by capturing men in uniform crying about the new conscription laws in her project called We Won a Lottery. Even if a photo project was published in 2015, it was severely judged by the older generation, calling the young men lazy and unmanly for not wanting to attend the compulsory army. Before 1990, every healthy male would get a conscription letter in the USSR and would have to serve in the Red Army for at least 2 years abroad. Therefore, the older men felt like they had the permission to judge the young men, which were called up to the army, and tried to avoid it. The men in pictures were even infamously called the crybabies, which sparked a provocative discussion in Lithuanian society. Why is a man not allowed to cry? The project has shown that a huge part of the older generation of the Lithuanian population still see men in this immutable way, even 25 years after the re-establishment of independence in 1990. These days, a set of traditional Soviet values of a person fall under the cynical term Homo Sovieticus, coined by Leonidas Donskis, which is a play on the term Homo sapiens. The person is seen as a rule follower, and the main qualities of him or her are A. Being indifferent to his or her work results. B. Being obedient to the government. C. Being passive towards any injustice, and so on. Later on, the term evolved to post-Homo Sovieticus, identifying the same set of behaviors, like passiveness and obedience, which were to be passed on to the new generation born after the fall of the USSR in the 1990s. Childrearing practices in Lithuania have noticeably changed during the Soviet occupation. Due to a changing ideological stance, a new type of motherhood arose. Shebek mentions a, quote, Stalinist mother, who was authoritarian, dominating and emotionally distant towards her children, yet overly involved in her own career. Unquote. Also, alcohol abuse was a huge social issue in the USSR, as it was seen as one of the very few sources of entertainment and leisure. Because of a Stalinist mother approach to parenting, officially advised emotionally abusive parenting styles and normalized alcohol consumption, child abuse was a common childrearing practice. A Lithuanian male in the 1990s most probably has seen physical abuse in the compulsory Red Army, if one has not experienced it in family. A part of the interview with Radvile Kudarauskaite was dedicated to questions about his days in the army. Every male got a calling letter after one's 18th birthday. The calling would take place twice a year. The conscripted men would be sent out to random military bases across the USSR. A restrictive and abusive practice dedovshchina took place. It meant various types of abuse and humiliation for the freshmen, and respect for one would only be gained gradually during one's service in the army. Some unlucky servants could not mentally bear the violence and would end up in psychiatric wards. The army officials were only seat warmers and did not care about the young servants, so they would give their authority away to older servants, what created this absurd hierarchy in the army. Before 1990s, the fashionable body ideal would be famous Western actors from films like Rambo or Mamma Mia, the movie. As Kudarauskaite remembers, these films would be watched in secret by groups of about 10 people, as it was an illegal activity to do so. The interviewee has also mentioned that some people would watch foreign porn films too, which might have been the only true source of sex education and, quite possibly, misconceptions about male sexual performance. To continue with the body ideals, underground bodybuilding clubs were established in response to the films seen by the youngsters. Bodybuilding was mostly a practice to show off strength and masculinity. After the re-establishment of Lithuanian independence in 1990, the brutal masculine cultural ideals have been updated for the worse. Most of Lithuanians of the 1990s were not financially stable, with exceptions of businessmen and the mafia. Due to complex changes in a country like privatization of previously government-owned property, new currency and a shift to liberalism, the timing was brilliant for questionable businesses and organized crime to form. The most influential gang of the 1990s was Daktarini, named after its founder Henrikas Daktaras. Some widows of criminal world figures believed that young men chose to join gangs, as there was a common belief that bahuri, meaning hooligans and gangsters, quote, are attractive and sexy, as said by Dargis. Mafia was known to be extremely violent, causing fights and killing wealthy businessmen, or harassing their families. Most fight clubs were owned by the gangs, making it easier to attract young credulous men to the shady businesses, whilst covering up as a sports club. The obsession with sports might have an alternative explanation. Basketball is named the second religion of Lithuania, as the national male basketball team has been really successful in international games since the 1980s. The country is obsessed with male sports, and that is another chance for a man to prove his dominance. Quote, sporting men become the honorary ambassadors of the state, where success and failures turn into national ecstasy or mourning. On the other hand, women almost do not have a chance to represent sports in Lithuanian media, for fear of destroying the myth of dominating masculinity, unquote, as said by Kudarauskaite. Times were turbulent, and young men lacked guidance, and it might be the cause of why so many of them ended up in criminal activities. The assuring masculine look was probably the biggest reason why the gangster life appealed to so many young males in Lithuania. It was only the luxurious facade of a cruel crime world, which drew naive youngsters to join the gangs. Being hungry for money, hungry for freedom, and hungry for status was the Western gangster dream come true. Abuse against women was very common. Dargis explains a reported violent outburst against a partner of a gang member in 2006. The latter locked her up and brutally beat her up, later explaining his behavior in court as sexual preference. It explains how violence are one of the tropes of masculinity in Lithuania, in what ways it is justified and just how toxic it is to all genders. Sadly enough, the pressures men put to themselves to achieve the fashionable masculinity ideal in the Lithuanian society come back to them in boomerang. Historical, cultural, and psychological factors have made the men responsible to keep up a harsh masculine image and most often ignore their emotional needs and mental health. Lithuanian men would benefit from being open about their struggles in life, instead of dealing with it in toxic ways. It is all summed up in upsetting statistics. Men in Lithuania are twice as likely to commit suicide in comparison to women, as you can see it in the table. Suicide rates of Lithuania are also known to be one of the highest in the world, even if these have been decreasing since 1995, as noted by World Population Review in 2020. Ideal masculine image make Lithuanian men happy? Most probably, rarely. Society would benefit from the construction of the stigmas and trauma to Lithuanians, especially men, most of which have faced violence against them, either it being questionable childrearing practices, abuse in the Red Army, or general pressure to perform in a certain way from the society. In the context of contemporary feminism, it is important to also understand what men go through, too, and help them deconstruct the toxic trope. Simply, it is not fashionable to suffer anymore. Up, a Lithuanian fashionable male ideal in the 1990s, fashion-wise, could be explained as static, fearful look, which shows no signs of original self-expression. The main point of a male clothing was to show dominance and wealth, with very little variations. Any ideas outside of a normalized male frame might have been seen as feminine, therefore pederast, an undesirable trait of the society of the men day, which shows the stiffness and close-mindedness inherited from the Soviet times, as well as homophobia. A fashionable Lithuanian male of the 1990s was a tough, harsh-mannered, masculine and brutal man, desirably with a fun and beautiful blonde lady next to him. The influence came from a violent gangster image. The focal point of a personality was power and violence. Being educated or well-mannered were not considered as cool traits. In conclusion, it must be acknowledged that the male image in Lithuania has been changing after the 2000s, as foreign ideals have come through and popular culture has changed tremendously. Lithuania is an independent state now. The attitudes towards men and amongst them are transforming. Thank you.